Now we are officially live for the Coachlogik Mentorship first free Friday of each and every month. This is April 5th. So for everyone who is tuning in or will tune in, we welcome you to the mentorship call, which this call, the first call of the month, is always a bit less formal, um, a bit more kind of free flowing, a bit more comprehensive. We look at coaching, we look at research, performance science, we kind of look at everything and anything, influenced heavily by the last few weeks of discussion. Today, I think Max is probably catching some Z's in Phuket, Thailand, where he's commentating his face off for 2 weeks. And we had a catch up. We had a catch up conversation that was actually recorded. So there's a podcast episode of that at the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. If people want to check that out. We talked about the sheer number of world records that had already been broken by the time we were just out of the 50 something weight classes. So that's a great episode. Highly recommend checking out for that. That's why Max is not here, and we have not instead, but because of that, we have Chris Tabor. Chris, how you doing?
Good. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. I'm really excited for this chat. I feel like the mentorship and the quality of the conversations and information only continues to get better. I'm really excited to continue kind of including you on these. So to start, let's just kind of do some current event stuff. What have you thought of all the World Cup action so far?
It's been very interesting and very exciting. I think for a while in the last quad, everyone was so conservative due to the points that we didn't see huge performances. But the way it's set up now, people are really getting after it, which is resulting in world records and a lot of really good lifts.
Yeah.
You do see a lot of bomb outs, which we suspected. People are bombing out because they're getting after it, but you also get to see like on the line emotional performances, which is pretty cool. And it's been like every class, someone's attempting records, world records, and multiple lifts. I mean, we saw Hampton Morris got the U.S. world record, so first time in many years. I think it's 70s,
Yeah.
60s, 70s. And then those were just great lifts.
Yeah, it's been insane, and I think it's when I was talking to Max, he mentioned the Olympics and not being able to commentate that, and a lot of people think the Olympics is the big thing. That's the really the big deal in weightlifting, and as people in weightlifting, you realize like the Olympics is kind of lackluster compared to a lot of the events leading up. We tend to see less, impressive performances. You don't see the depth of competition. If Team China has to pick one person and they have two or three great competitors, or if you have, say, someone like an Olivia Reeves, or a better example is the 73 class. Like they're unlikely to send Shi when he's the best, one of the best in the world. So you're not going to see that depth at 73 because of that. And people watch the Olympics, they think that's weightlifting. I wish they could watch the World Cup and see that, like, at its epitome, this is what weightlifting is.
Yeah, interestingly, we're working on an attempt paper in weightlifting from historical data. And while it's still in the works, we ran the analysis on, really like European, like continental championships versus world versus the Olympics. And the Olympics is different than the other competitions and its outcomes, likely because people are trying to move into medal placements and they may be more conservative to not bomb out. The third attempts might be big, but you notice a different pattern than, let's say, the world championships that occur every year. And before, they were trying to score points. So this new system has really unlocked some differences in how lifters may, go to attempts on the platform.
Well, we've heard athletes talk about how extreme this qualification procedure has been and how tough it has been. And, as viewers, as fans of the sport, as enthusiasts, as people who love weightlifting, it's great to see the World Cup. But you wonder how sustainable that is. It's like the last make or break, do or die event that makes a lot of sense. But this wouldn't be stretched out or sustained over a long period. It almost makes sense that like the Olympics probably a lot more realistic in terms of how to game the sport quite a bit more. And it's different. You don't have snatch medals, you don't have clean and jerk medals. You're just kind of vying for the top spot. So there are a lot of differences. And I wonder how, I wish we would be a part of deciding how the sport would kind of like progress the qualification procedures, because I'm interested to see how this could influence the next quad, given that this is definitely ending it on a high point. I don't know about the rest of it, but this definitely makes it seem like, yeah, this was a great choice to have this style of qualification.
Well, I'm sure if you have enough money, you could pay someone off in the IWF and change the qualification procedures for the next time around.
Yeah.
Just have to cross some country border lines and show up at the president's house with a truckload of cash. And you can get it changed.
That's funny. And Chris, to transition a little bit more into more performance related topics, we kind of always skirt around, like we have research, we have actual practice, we have kind of everything in between. What have you been interested in lately? What have kind of been your, like, not research hobby horses, but like performance hobby horses? What you've thought a lot about, what you've thought about implementing, how you thought about maybe changing your practice because of what you've seen or what you've been thinking about lately. So has anything kind of come to mind, or anything past your desk in terms of studies or research that has got you thinking about the coaching process?
I think for me right now, like my research focus is on accentuated eccentric loading. And so I've put a lot of energy into that bucket. So I've been working with Tim Sukamel on some projects. We're trying to look at the underlying constructs of how to implement that the best way possible. And so transferring some of that to the sport of weightlifting, like learning how you could implement it with the squatting variations, what could we do with some jumping variations, I think will be helpful because it's a large maximal strength stimulus. So that is something that I've been working on as my research line. And then independent of that, what I've worked on during this time, this whole semester really has been on barbell trajectory, looking into that in depth and starting to move into the really computer vision, and getting an efficient pathway so that coaches can examine barbell trajectory very quickly and seamlessly in their practice. And so those have been my really big focus points recently.
Yeah. And with accentuated eccentric loading, I know we've had a few conversations around that. We've talked about kind of where you're at. We've tried to discuss, mechanisms, practical application, actually implementing it within a program. Where are you at with using it, and what are your thoughts? Like, if you study, it's one of those things where, like, if you were to study something rigorously, try your best to understand it, know as much about it as possible, and then you don't use it. I mean, I don't know what that says about either the implementation or practicality of it, or just the body of research itself. So where are you at with AEL?
So what we've really broken down have been the phases. So we have the braking phase and the propulsive phase that we've used in the squat. And we've determined that accentuated eccentric loading is a heavy force dominant exercise. So force production capabilities go up from using it, but it is heavily fatiguing in the early phases. So using this as a maximal strength stimulus is probably the best way to go. And we would want to use it with our strongest athletes. So it seems to be an advanced training method. And maybe if someone's squat is stalling out, you have an athlete where, they get to a level and their squat seems to kind of plateau out, where the investment in time to move the squat would remove time from the other portions of their lifting, and it's not very effective. Those would be the individuals where I would incorporate it in to provide a stimulus to get the squat moving again. And we would probably use it for 3 to 4 weeks, then remove it and go back into regular squatting after that. The next thing that we really did was look at dumbbell accentuated eccentric loading. So you hold dumbbells, you go down and then drop them and jump afterwards. And we have shown better braking abilities with that. And how that could transfer is really in the jerk exercise,
Mm.
because you have the braking phase and the jerk, and then you need to transfer to the drive phase. And so doing some weighted jumping where you release that braking phase may help the jerk exercise with that reactive strength component. And so for now, I feel fairly confident those are some areas that weightlifters could benefit from this accentuated eccentric loading.
Yeah, and maybe we can even, since this is kind of your research line and where you put a lot of effort and energy, let's kind of deep dive into this. Um, Thinking about it a little bit more, I know we've talked about mechanisms. That's always, I recorded a podcast with Dr. David Pewter, and um, I was talking about the impact of resistance training, strength training on mental health, and I kept kind of prodding for mechanisms, and he was like, "Yeah, there's like BDNF and all these like epigenetic changes." He's like, "But there are too many things at play." I was like, "Well, like, what do you think is really?" And he's like, "It's just way too much, But you do know that there's a change in outcome. So, from his perspective, in that conversation, the mechanism or mechanisms wasn't necessarily critical or relevant for the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Here, when we talk about that, what are some of the mechanisms allowing for increases in maximal strength? Knowing that we're overloading we're doing a better job overloading the eccentric portion of the movement.
Correct. So you have to consider a few different mechanisms here. So the first one we could probably consider would be the neural mechanisms. So we know that for the same absolute load, if you're lifting 100 kilos on the eccentric and the concentric, we're more efficient at lowering that in the eccentric phase. It comes at a lower metabolic cost, and we are better able to handle it because it's not near our maximal capability on the eccentric. The other factor is that if you're able to overload the eccentrics, you're able to tap into different motor unit pools. You're able to get into your high threshold motor units more quickly. And that's different than your concentric ability, because you're going to ultimately be limited by what you can stand back up. And in the eccentric phase, we're probably 140% stronger in the
Wow.
exercises that matter to us. There are some muscles that might be stronger, like isolated, but let's think of like a squat or something like that. We can probably lower safely 140%. And that was from a recent study that came out. So knowing that, we have this gap in what our nervous system can do eccentrically, and we can tap into that by loading it effectively. The next thing we could consider is that as we lower the weight down, we're more effective because your cross bridges are probably already attached, increasing your force production. And then through the molecular spring tighten, that's stretched because the motor unit heads are already attached on the way down, making it more effective. And we tend to see a little bit better stretch shortening cycle ability if you have no technical breakdown with that enhanced speed on the eccentric portion. So those would be some like neural and muscular effects. We have seen at the molecular level changes in protein synthesis and changes in the myonuclear changes, so favoring fast phenotypic responses that favor your type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers. And those we looked at with the changes in myosin heavy chains. And so that's different than traditional loading. They looked at both against each other, and this tends to favor those fast phenotypic expressions. And so for our sport in particular, type 2X and type 2A are the fastest shortening velocities. So if we can target them to a greater extent than type 1, then we may shift the shortening velocity capabilities, making us be able to activate more quickly, shorten more quickly, and then it would affect the power output. And then what we have seen, like as far as outcomes from these mechanisms, is a clear indication that AEL increases maximum strength to the same extent or greater compared to traditional loading. And yet no studies have shown a decrease. Like it wasn't bad. So it's either good or better. And then we have seen the same thing with hypertrophy. It's either equal or better compared to traditional loading.
That's incredibly convincing. And it's funny because I was talking to one of my athletes, Derek, And he was talking about plyometrics, and he's like, why don't you incorporate them? I'm like, well, I'm still thinking about them, or trying to conceptualize how I could use them and how they fit into my model, like my process. And it's the same thing with AEL. Like I've talked to you multiple times. I've thought about it, and like hearing you talk about it now, it's becoming more and more convincing to where I'd be interested in trialing them out. That makes a lot of sense. I have a couple like questions related to the implementation. We don't really. I've heard of heavy walkouts in powerlifting, but I
Mhm.
really haven't seen anyone use weight releasers or accentuated eccentric loading in powerlifting, which is like the maximal strength of all maximal strength sports, in the squat, bench, and deadlift. I imagine now after this conversation, I'm going to kind of play around with it intellectually, maybe get some weight releasers and play around with it practically. Do you think there's just a gap, not a gap in the research, but like a gap of research to implementation, maybe in powerlifting or in other avenues of developing maximal strength, and that's why we're not quite seeing the use of AEL, or is it more popular than I'm kind of leading to believe?
Well, there's two things here. One is that for a while it wasn't accessible because we didn't have the equipment. So people probably weren't going to use it because they had to build their own custom weight releasers. Now they're mass produced by Rogue, which is totally fine. But interestingly enough, the concept of this and how I got involved is because Dr. Stone found some evidence that super heavyweight weightlifters used these in their squat training to break through squat plateaus late in their career when their squat had stalled for multiple years. And this was the only thing that could get it moving. And then later, if you look in some of the old West Side videos with Louis Simmons, there are weight releasers in his gym.
Mm,
So he attempted to use them, but they probably don't work with his style of
yeah.
powerlifting, the suited powerlifting. But they can definitely be used with the style of powerlifting that's more common now, which is
Mm.
the less suits, but more of like single ply gear and things like that. And raw lifting are probably going to benefit. And so when it comes to implementation, I think it was just an equipment issue as opposed to an implementation. But we also didn't have a lot of answers on how to
Mm.
use it best. People were kind of using a shotgun approach, using different loading schemes and how heavy we wanted to go. And we hadn't really done a systematic evaluation of the best way to do it. And now, as more evidence is coming out, I think we can make a stronger case for implementing it with certain sports.
Yeah, and I was actually just on a podcast recently, and I said that I think I gave out more common value, which is eccentrically you can produce about 120% of the force that you can concentrically. You said 140%. Um,
Mhm.
what was the study, and what was kind of the protocol that found that?
So the study was I believe, a meta-analysis conducted by James Nuzzo that just came out, and it looks at the strength of eccentric contractions, and they did it through the whole body. So they basically broke down every study they could find, and the range was really 140 to 160%. The only problem is you're not really going to test the maximal eccentric because what happens when you fail your maximal
Yeah.
eccentric? Probably nothing good. So they probably took it up to the point where safety became an issue. So I don't think we know the exact max that someone could do, but we have a good range of safe outcomes. But from the literature, the most I've seen used was between 120 and 130% on complex movements like
Mm.
squatting and bench pressing and things like that. In isolated muscle groups where you do it in like an isokinetic dynamometer, you can go a little bit heavier because you're locked into a machine on a strict range of motion. And that's why I said on the ones that we actually care about, 140 is probably the upper tolerable limit for someone to handle.
So then that would kind of lead me to start thinking about implementation, right? And the practicality
Mm-hmm.
of doing it. So you say you want to start using some sort of protocol that takes advantage of it. I know we've spoken about this a bit. We talked about intensities or proximities to failure, so load. We've talked about volume, and we've talked about like time of implementation. You mentioned like a maximal strength block. As far as um, the actual like weight on the bar, are you trying to almost mirror the percent of 1 RM eccentrically with percent of 1 RM one arm concentrically. So if you're doing, 80% on the bar of your one RM that you can stand up with, are you trying to mirror that with, 80% of your one RM that you could basically like sit down with? Or how are you determining load for that portion of the lift?
So this is an excellent question and something that we're still trying to answer fully to give the best picture. But you can basically break AEL down into maximal, so 100% of your concentric max, or supramaximal. And in general, when you start to use this, you want to start at the maximal end, around 100% of your max on the way down. And then you want to use it on a spectrum of loads until you get to your heaviest working set. So you load the weight on the beginning that you're going to use, you go through your warm-up sets, and then at your top sets, you use it there. And so typically you're looking at like 100% on the way down, and then anywhere from 70 to 80% on the concentric portion. What you find is if you go heavier than that, it becomes very, very difficult to complete the reps with good technique because you're so tired from the loading. So even things like as high as 85%, it can become a grind. Your bar velocities drop quite a bit, and that might be more advantageous for powerlifting than maybe the sport of weightlifting, because it becomes so force dominant at that point that it's probably not having the intended effect for weightlifting. So it might be better to use slightly lower intensities and then the higher eccentric. So for an example, you might do a set of, let's say, 3 to 5 repetitions concentrically. You might do the first repetition only with 100%, and then finish the rest of the set out normally. Would be one way to integrate it initially and see how someone responds.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, good training, right? Like you're on a program that gets you progressively stronger over time. Say you have a similar protocol each week and you have a similar RPE. So it's like 5 sets of 3 at RPE 8. With a quote unquote like good program or effective program, you would be able to add load a little bit every week and see about the same RPE. I've had that happen. The bar still feels freaking heavy out of the rack. And I'm almost wondering with AEL if part of that is almost like this deconditioning to heavy as you walk out 100% squat down, stand up. You get so used to not super maximal loads, but close to maximal loads that suddenly when I'm taking, a 5x3 at 80%, that first unrack and walkout's not really going to feel heavy. I'm going to feel a lot more confident. And I've had that to where I run 3 to 4 weeks. My squat keeps going up, but damn, the bar still feels heavy. So have you done any more qualitative work looking at the experience of using this and how it's changed bar feel out of the rack or bar feel on the way down?
We haven't quantified it, so I can't speak to what people would say. I can tell you anecdotally that after you do this, things feel better afterwards when you remove this. So, we, let's say, walk out 110, 115% of your squat max. You got to wait for a second as the hooks are shaking and stabilizing. So you're standing there with that heavy weight on your back. Then you descend down, it falls off, and you stand up much lighter. When that block ends and you go back, the next time you do 80%, you take it out of the rack after having 115% on your back, it doesn't feel terrible at all. It actually feels great. So this might be a point in time where if you want to expose someone to very heavy loading in a safe manner that's actually effective, this might be one way to do it. Because if you just do a rack hold, it's fine, but you don't really descend with the weight. So you're not used to bracing under the load unless you go down to the pins and stop, like a forced eccentric. So that might help, but that takes a lot of training time and resources, right? Because you got to put the plates on, lower it to the rack, strip the plates off, put it back up. With the hooks, it's just really quick, makes the session go more effectively. And it might be a way for someone who might be tentative with heavy weights to experience a super maximal load, and that might build confidence for them lowering.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm really interested in trying it out. I know we've talked about volume, so like the amount of this style of training that you would have to implement to get a result. Again, like another conversation, kind of talk about the dose response curve. And I'm sure like to a point, you kind of maximize the benefits of it. but doing a little bit of it probably has an effect, beyond not doing it. Have you guys, I mean, I don't know how much work you've done looking at this exactly, but where do you think that sweet spot is of, is it load the weight releasers every rep or the first rep of every set for a workout, for multiple workouts? You mentioned around 4 weeks. So what's the frequency of using this, and are we using it every single set?
So this has not been fully studied on like what's the best way across the month, but we have looked at the set and rep breakdown, so we have some idea there. I will say from using it in practice, twice a week is probably the max you would use it on the same exercise. So if you're squatting, doing this twice a week is very taxing. So you might have 2 days a week of the weight releasers and 1 day of regular squatting, or even just 2 days only of squatting using this because it's so stressful. If you're doing other exercises, sure, you could incorporate it on those. So if you're powerlifting and you want to do it on the squat and bench, go for it. They're going to be different. There will be fatigue, but it's acceptable to do it that way. And then there are 2 main ways you could use this in training. You could do a cluster set with it. You take it out of the rack, do a rep, put the bar back into the rack, reload the hooks, and then after a manner of rest, maybe 20 to 30 seconds, do it again. Or you can use it as a potentiation on the first repetition only, which will carry you out to about the 3rd repetition in a set. So then you could rack the bar back up, put the hooks back on, and do another set of 3, so you have a full set of 6. Or you could just do it on the first rep and finish your set out normally. Both of those ways can work. Interestingly, some new research came out of ETSU of using it on a more hypertrophy style block, where they used it with rest redistribution, like every other repetition in a set of 10, they used it, and they found some interesting effects there. It's pretty metabolically taxing, so it might increase your ability to buffer lactate and set you up better later on. And those papers, I believe, are starting to come out now.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, so I'm just trying to think of where to go, because I think this sounds like something that's, as you mentioned, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of cost, but there could be a lot of benefit. Anecdotally, and because I'm not sure if this has been measured, what's the effect on technique? And the reason I think about this is you mentioned bench press, and I'm so used to watching someone pull out a heavy bench, lower, lower, lower. They misgroove or go to the wrong spot because it's maximal, right? So you put the weight releasers on, you get it out of the rack, lower to the right spot, release, and then you drive up with the most efficient bar path, which is going to be up and back towards the rack. Have you seen a change in technique based on, someone getting used to lowering maximal weights in the right position and then being explosive out of the bottom? I'm thinking like that could be beneficial from that standpoint as well, not just like the physiological, like strength adaptations or hypertrophy adaptations.
Yeah, in any of the studies that we've done, we always incorporate in a learning phase where they practice with the weight releasers. The nice thing is people that are using these are usually quite strong, and they adapt very quickly. So once they get used to the swaying of the hooks, the lowering really doesn't matter because you are stronger and more efficient on the way down. So I haven't seen too many negative effects with that. The only thing that does change with some individuals is they will guard on the way down. Because it's so heavy, they will lower more slowly than their normal tempo typically would allow. But as they get more used to it, they begin to lower more efficiently, and they get more closer to their original technique as they go. And the closer you can be to normal, the more it'll carry over to performance. So after the first few times of using it, like 1 to 2 sessions, everyone's about as good as they're going to get using the weight releasers because it's not a huge learning curve.
So do you think this occupies I guess this actually leads into the questions we have from Lowenhertz Fitness, which is, do you think, the questions are separate, but they're going to lead in. Do you think AEL has a place outside of a maximal strength block? So you said there can be changes in hypertrophy outcomes or improvements in hypertrophy outcomes, improvements in maximal strength. Is there an extension of that beyond just maximal strength blocks that you would use them for?
So right now, I think there is limited evidence that they could aid in hypertrophy. in a plan. We know that it can cause hypertrophy, but I don't think we have enough evidence to say this is the best way to use them and say, like, use it for 4 weeks, do it on these exercises, and it will potentially result in this much hypertrophy. So I'm tentative on their use. I would imagine it's equal to regular loading or maybe better due to the extra eccentric work, but I don't want to speculate until we have more evidence in that regard. But the other place I could definitely see this being used would be submaximal accentuated eccentric loading in jumping. And that's with the use of dumbbells or lightly loaded, less than your max in squatting and items like that, where you're favoring the velocity end of the spectrum and trying to get better power outputs. So there's some good evidence that in athletes using AEL, it increases their jump height and their power output when you use the right loading, which is about 10 to 30% of your body mass. So you have two dumbbells, you figure out what 10% is, you divide that weight between the two dumbbells, and then you drop the weights and then you jump afterwards. And that tends to enhance performance immediately after. And so that can increase your power output. How much that's going to carry over to weightlifting is yet to be seen, but we do know that weightlifters do jumps. And if this is just another way to do jumping alongside your normal training, it may have an additive effect in that regard.
Yeah, that's really interesting. 10% of someone's body weight doesn't seem like a lot. So it doesn't take that much weight to create that like effective stimulus. Oh, interesting. That's something I have a hard time convincing the high schoolers of, when it's like, use 20% of your back squat. The next thing I know, they have like 70% loaded up and they're trying to jump with it. It's a hard won battle. So the reason why I mentioned this leading into the questions is because this is looking at the World Cup and then the training hall and what people are doing on, their taper week or their peaking block, or, at the tail end of their peaking block. Maybe they're tapering, maybe they're snatching 180 in the training hall. So Lowen Hertz Fitness kind of has 3 comments, and I'll just read it all so people have context. Not sure how this fits into the specifics of the discussion you guys are going to have, but I'd be interested in knowing the thoughts on the last couple of days of the World Cup, the training hall, e.g. Carlos more or less maxing out a power jerk at 220 kilos, and many other athletes maxing out their squat with only a couple of days out of a major competition. What kind of adaptation are they hoping for, and why is that 180 degrees different to everything we teach normal athletes on tapering and getting rid of fatigue before competing to peak? Thank you. So I think there are a few things that stand out there. The first question, what kind of adaptation are they hoping for? They're not hoping for an adaptation. With Carlos, I've heard Max talk about this extensively, and a lot of that is like he just goes into the training hall and does whatever he wants, and he just takes weights up until he misses. So I don't think there's necessarily a rhyme or reason to it. And thinking about it too, there's not going to be like a long term. When we talk about adaptation, I think hopefully you're referencing something that's a little more long term, like developing maximal strength, developing muscular size, developing these different adaptations that take a little bit. You could potentiate performance, which isn't necessarily a physiological adaptation. You're just kind of heightening your ability to express, force in a snatch or in a clean or a jerk. So I don't think they're hoping for an adaptation. I think they're hoping for some sort of potentiation. And then why is it 180 degrees different? Than we teach normal athletes. They're also not normal athletes. You're not going to see any other 81 kilo lifter or 89 or anyone around that body weight walk into a training hall and snatch 180 and clean and power jerk 220. So they're the epitome of not normal or abnormal. So they have different tapering protocols. Their training is so different that when they go into a training hall, what looks like, outlandish to us could be pretty backed off. And I'm not saying that like going to maximum is necessarily backing off, but in a typical Bulgarian system where you have maximal lifts very frequently, all of the time, doing it in the training hall, a handful of days out isn't necessarily abnormal. So I don't know if they're trying to necessarily get rid of fatigue, but just stay in shape and stay sharp, or just have some fun. So it's a bit of a different approach. And when Max and I spoke about this, he kind of mentioned like seeing this as a theme in training halls that other countries have converged on, which is training heavier more often and doing heavier pulls and variations. And I kind of posed the question, I wonder in American training halls, in back rooms, when we're going to start seeing just heavier lifts more often, heavier variations, heavier pulls, and see some sort of convergence towards, what is more common at an international level. So Chris, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, my first thought was that Carlos was just back there trying to intimidate everyone else. And like if he can power jerk 220, people are like, oh shit, like what chance do I have?
Yeah.
So that was the first thing I thought. Like, what's the purpose of this? Just to talk some shit, and scare some people. So if anyone thought that they had a chance, like you're gonna have to come from this guy that can power jerk 220. He totaled 400, which is absurd. I think the heaviest I remember in the 82 and a half class was 410. And so I think that was Vardanyan, and Asen Zlatev from Bulgaria did 410 in the same meet. And so 400 at 89 in a training hall is just absurd. Now, when it comes to why might they do it in the back, one is that they need to maintain their power output that falls off within a matter of days. And their volume is probably extremely low at this point compared to what they've been doing. So during a tapering phase for strength and power sports, the reduction in volume with the maintenance or an increase in intensity actually will yield better results. So that's likely what they're doing. And there is a potentiation effect that can last a matter of hours after a training session. And they've done a little bit of work showing a training session in the morning can actually make the competition later in the day better. And there is some limited evidence that training on, let's say, a Monday can affect Tuesday as the nervous system stays fresh and adaptable. So you're probably seeing a lot more of that type of training because that's what they're trying to do, is to maintain those neural outputs and that neural drive to the greatest extent so that it doesn't drop off before competition. And these individuals are professionals. They're working weights and volumes that they're doing leading up to competition are very large. So even though for us, we're like, why are they lifting so heavy right before? Probably not very stressful on them in terms of total volume. Even though the weights are extremely heavy, those sessions are quick compared to what they're used to doing.
Yeah, and there was something that Eric Helms mentioned on a different podcast. I don't remember who mentioned it, but it really stuck out to me. There are 3 effects from a training session. There are performance effects, fatigue effects, and potentiation effects. And I think when you have that potentiation effect, you can kind of think about training a little bit differently. We're not just developing something, more short to medium to long term, but something like immediately after, in the seconds, the minutes, the hours, the days. And then the next thing is, I remember I spent a bit of time at Cal with the football team, kind of in the weight room, and I would watch them, go do all of their conditioning work, then come straight into the weight room, do all of their weight room work, and then go straight onto the field and then practice. And they're doing that, multiple times a week, really high volumes. And you're like, how do people tolerate that? And it's this idea of work capacity being highly malleable, but also, if you're a D1 athlete, at Cal, like you're cream of the crop. And when we look at these international lifters at the World Cup, it's the same thing. And it's that caliber of athlete, up a notch in weightlifting, which is the best of the best. They should be able to tolerate a lot of training, a lot of heavy training. They're so consistent and their technique is so reliable and developed that they're not just getting really sloppy or really lazy with really heavy attempts. So when he does a 180 snatch, it's like, he has to be so dialed in and so perfect to make it. Whereas if you get normal athletes and you have them go heavy as often or as much, they might fall apart and things might kind of go out of the window. And on the other side of that, if Carlos, you mentioned, has that mentality of, I want to show them that I'm the best and that they're going to lose. And I'll do that in the training hall with a 220 power jerk. Whereas you take someone, again, who's like a quote unquote normal athlete, they might not have that mindset or that mentality or that like fearlessness to do it and to really like send a message, or they're just not capable of physically sending a message, because maybe they snatch 110 and clean and jerk 130, and it's like it's not having that same effect from the D session. So there's a lot of nuance there, but I think we can learn a lot about comfort, consistency, and the strategic use of heavier lifts. And I think, one thing people kind of back away from because they're somewhat scared of the fatigue boogeyman is, heavy lifts, heavy singles. And the idea of just getting comfortable, being able to do them well and do them often, is something we should be moving towards, not moving farther away from. And, that's one thing I always taught, kind of comment to Max about is like, how did you squat to a maximum 8 times a day? And the fact he was able to do that kind of lends credence to you can build towards going heavier more often. Maybe not 8 times a day intermixed with snatches and clean and jerks, but you can go heavy and you can recover from it. It's not going to be, a life or limb thing.
Yeah, totally.
So you mentioned AEL. We discussed some of the questions coming in. What are some other things that you've been really fascinated with and thinking a lot about that you think would be useful for coaches and coaches and athletes to think more about or hear more about?
For me in particular, I've really been focusing on this barbell trajectory and patterning and learning how we can effectively build it into a training plan. So with the emergence of, AI that can teach itself on a data set, it's really going to lend itself well to barbell tracking and pattern recognition because it's going to move in a similar pattern all the time. And you spoke with Dr. Aaron Cunanan recently, who did his dissertation on barbell trajectory. I know he did a talk at Coaches Only. And they've really identified 4 patterns that have emerged in weightlifting. It used to just be 3 patterns, but now there's a 4th pattern that has really popped up, which might be due to how we're developing athletes now and their body proportions, how they're built, where they're able to stay a lot more upright and engage the quads a lot more compared to previous types of lifting, which was more posterior chain dominant. Because we're actually seeing some changes in modern lifting, and that's probably reflective of that. The reason that trajectory becomes so important is if we can quantify the variables of the barbell, we can choose and direct the training by picking the right exercises that maximize the portions of the lift that are being affected the most. So a good example here for people to take home, if someone's not displacing the barbell to a high enough degree, they're not going to have enough room to get under the bar and make it. So that could be as simple as you're not strong enough to lift the weight. We need to build more strength in the legs. Or it could be that we need to build in more pulling strength because we're not able to elevate the bar in the correct position. And so that would be something like barbell height, the height that you need to get underneath. And if you quantify it with a lift, with machine learning or computer vision, and you look over time, this many pulls were done, resulting in this much improvement at this weight and barbell height, we can then quantify the efficiency of the plan in directing to that goal. Because if you don't have that number, and you're like, all right, we need to pull the bar higher. Well, what does that mean? How much higher do we need to pull it? Or is it high enough? And there are other aspects of getting under the barbell that we don't know. If you don't quantify it, you can't build out a way to do it. The other way that's effective, we often talk about barbell height, but the forward-backward displacement of the barbell horizontally is important. And there's an optimal range in which the barbell should travel in and around the body. And by knowing that distance it should travel for the lifter that you're working with, we could pick exercises to help that, right? Ones that help shorten that distance that the bar travels so there's not a large loop. Or maybe in the transition phase, the barbell is getting away from you. Then we build exercises that remove that portion of it getting away from you. We put some constraints on the lifts to really nail in that portion of the lift. And then over time, if we do a block, we say, all right, your horizontal displacement was 5 centimeters. Now it's 3, and you have made this many more consecutive lifts. We can say that your technique has been altered enough that resulted in a better technical efficiency. So we're able to quantify the actual changes that are occurring instead of saying, well, it looks better. Sure. But it looks better by how much, right? And so that's where we bring a strategic approach to coaching as opposed to just build this out and hope something good happens from it.
Yeah, it's funny because, as a coach myself and someone who writes a lot of programs, it's like, okay, have we done what we wanted to do? I think so. I think we spent like 8 weeks on it. Maybe we just transitioned. You don't have any like hard and fast, like actual data to say, yeah, we've actually made progress in this thing. Like I can say it looks better, or we've spent sufficient time, or the lifts we've been using, you've been able to use more weight. But realistically, like I just kind of have that eye test of, yeah, you look better. And it's like, I don't know, are they still looping the bar at the top? Are they still like, they still kind of letting the bar come off the hips a little earlier excessively? And then you're kind of like, you're trying to like retrofit, or overlay old videos on top of new videos where you're watching and you're like, yeah, it looks a little better, but you're not quite sure. What's the technology or the tools? And I know Max is, coming out with something massive for this. So we're going to have a direct, applicable, perfect resource for all coaches soon. But, in the interim, what are some good apps, good tools to use? So if I give someone a lot of like, highly technical work and they do it over time and I say, you look better, I can also corroborate that with actual data.
Yeah, so I'm working with Max on that side of the computer vision to get a really seamless integration that will show up on an app for someone. Right now, the app that has been validated that will give you both bar speed and displacement of the barbell, just vertical displacement at this time, is the Metric VBT app. I believe it's $10. So we validated it in our lab. So I feel confident with the data that came out of it. It's very consistent on the displacement. So that is nice. And the velocity data is pretty quick to get. In the future, what we hope to look at is like pattern recognition and then getting all of the metrics that you would want from a barbell. So there are multiple forward and rearward displacements. You have the bar height, and then you have what's called barbell drop from peak height to when you fixate it within your hands. And then you would have the bar speeds as well, like your velocities attached to that would all come out at once. So that's like an app you can buy that's very easy to use. If you're technically savvy, there's a free computer program called Canovia, and you can film using a high-speed camera, and then you can break down the bar path. It has a tracking app within it. You can overlay a grid, and then by knowing how many frames per second, you can break down each phase and know how long each one occurred, so you can generate your own velocities. And then you can track the bar path and height over time by drawing a line directly on the screen with the grid. It takes a little bit more processing, but if you're working with some advanced athletes, it may be worth the time it takes to learn that program so you can quantify the outcomes.
Yeah, and then I just sit patiently waiting for you and Max to finish developing this product, so I don't have to do any of that, because I like, as a coach, it's something where like you mentioned Metric VBT, and I'm like, that sounds perfect. Get my phone out, take a video, upload it, get some information kicked out and generated, just so I can say like, okay, is this corroborating with what I've seen? What can I communicate to the athlete? It's seamless, it's fast. And I think that's like the next level. And I think having that accessible is going to be huge. And also, coming from sources, coming from people who are reliable too, and not just like, here's another company. I don't know anything about the company, the app, the people who have developed it. I don't know if it's, been validated. I don't know how reliable it is. So there are a lot of questions. I'm very confident in this thing being the thing going forward. If anyone listening, I mean, we had a few people. If anyone listening wants to drop in some questions, please do. Let's kind of round out. Chris, what are some things you're looking forward to in the future, in terms of work? What kind of questions are you asking? What kind of work is coming out? Is it all kind of still in that same line? Are you looking at, things potentially that we haven't talked about that you're wanting to know more about?
Yeah, so main research line is AEL research as it relates to jumping and squatting movements. Right now, we've got some stuff going in the bench press.
Mm.
Next steps is heavily involved in weightlifting research. So doing some stuff on barbell trajectories, um, and doing computer vision, and then integrating in some machine learning for pattern recognition is going to be the next step. I work with an engineering group at my university, so they're going to help with this pattern recognition. And the hope is to be able to take this to a world championships and then collect all the lifts, quickly analyze the data, and then be able to report it back out
Mm.
in a format for coaches to digest. That would be the next ideal step. And then hopefully start to build out some training studies with alterations in barbell trajectory following a given amount of work being completed. Those would be some of my next steps going forward into this next year.
Yeah, I think those are really what I've been, when I read research, that's really what I'm looking for, like those training studies um, that either follow some sort of, not a case study, but some sort of like, protocol that makes sense, some sort of like normal typical training plan, and then it tracks outcomes over time, or there's some sort of intervention and it tracks outcomes over time. Those are the things I really look forward to reading. I find very practical, and very interesting. So looking forward to that. If people want to keep up with your work, keep up with your research, know more about you, even know more about the program that you oversee at Sacred Heart.
Mm-hmm.
If they are, I'm assuming a handful of people we have listening are students. I know that for
Mm-hmm.
a fact because they reach out about West Virginia University. So if they're interested in learning more about you, learning more about the program, all of that information, where can they go to find more?
Yeah, you can go on Instagram. It's Dr. Chris Tabor there. You can reach out. I'm on Twitter. You can reach out to me. My email is taborc@sacredheart.edu, and happy to answer any questions. We do have 2 open graduate assistant spots in our program, which are funded partially, so not full funding, but those would be working with me on our weightlifting projects and our sports science monitoring that we do with our teams. And then we have 2 high school strength and conditioning positions open that are half scholarships. So if you're accepted there, you get to coach for a full year. You get half your schooling paid for, and you're the full-time strength coach at a high school. We have 2 of those going right now up in Connecticut. So if anyone is interested in those positions, let me know and I can give you more information.
That sounds awesome. It sounds like a little bit for everyone, depending on what they want. If they want to go more the S&C route, the sports science route, or the weightlifting route, which is really cool. It's cool to see that integrated so well and at a really high level. So I would implore people to check out those opportunities. If people are interested in following me, you can follow my Instagram account if you aren't already at Josh_PhilWL. You can follow Team Ada and check out everything that Max, myself, and the rest of us have to offer there. Just drop your name in a contact form in whatever questions or comments or interests you guys have along with that. I thought this was a great conversation. I'm really excited for people to kind of go back and listen to it and start implementing AEL into their training. And then I guess the last thing, Chris, where would you pick up weight releasers if you were looking for them and wanted to implement them into your training? Is Rogue the best place?
Right now, that's going to be the best option. Rogue has the nice set. They're not terribly expensive. And as far as I know, that they have the most standardized. I'm sure Titan Fitness has ripped them off by now. So you might be able to find them there, but we have the Rogue ones in the lab. They work really well. They have standardized heights, and they're really easy to load, which is nice.
Awesome. Yeah. So if anyone's interested in that, go pick up the weight releasers from Rogue. We don't have a discount code for that, sadly enough. And even if we did, I'm not sure we'd give it to you. I'm kidding. Check those out. If you guys have any questions about implementation, reach out to Chris, reach out to myself. I'm going to ask Chris for a bunch of papers and related articles that we can link in the mentorship group, and we can kind of get a dialogue going about. Thanks all for tuning in to this week's Free First Friday with Chris Tabor, because the lovely Max Ada is in bed snoozing currently, which he desperately needs his beauty sleep. And we will catch you all next week on on our next mentorship call with the Dr. Kyle Travis.
Nice.